Concerning Asceticism, Franklin Merrell Wolff. Throughout the history of religion, asceticism has played a highly important part both as an enjoined discipline and as a spontaneously accepted practice. Several reasons underlie such practices, many of which have been listed and discussed by William James in his Varieties of Religious Experience. However, I shall add certain considerations relative to this subject that have grown out of my personal experience and reflection. I am convinced that for most natures and perhaps for all, a certain degree of ascetic practice is necessary if the individual is to attain the highest possibilities. But while this is particularly true with respect to preparing the way for the awakening, the same principle applies nonetheless in the unfolding or developing of power or skill in any field whatsoever. Man wins power in any direction by concentration of effort in the appropriate sense, but this involves inevitably a suppression of diffused activity. Combined with the main interest at any given time, most men feel within themselves counter interests and desires, and if the latter are indulged, the former are sacrificed. Here is a sufficient basis for essentially ascetic practice, which may in extreme cases have all the value of mortifications characteristic of some of the religious disciplines. A man may do this for the mastery of an art, of a science, for the building of a business, etc., just as well as for an objective of the type more commonly classified as religious. If the main interest is so all consuming that there hardly remains any conflicting interest or desire, it may well be that but little discomfort is felt in the practice. On the other hand, important competing interests may cause the discipline to have the effect of real hardship, but in any case, mastery in any field does require such discipline. In the foregoing type of asceticism, there is no question of the essential sinfulness of the carnal nature. In fact, the rationale of asceticism may be developed entirely apart from the question of sin. Sin has been given a far too important place in religious thought and feeling. Such sin, as there may be, is largely incidental and the result of ignorance and thus fundamentally a delusion rather than an actuality. The result of giving to sin the respect and attention which underlies the idea that it is of sufficient importance to be a worthy object of warfare is that sin is actually given life and power. We never destroy anything by fighting it. A force that we fight may be temporarily crushed, but because at the same time we may be wielding a stronger force. But it remains true that we have won at the price of a certain exhaustion, and meanwhile the opposing force rebuilds itself, partly out of the very force we have expended. Then it comes back upon us when we are weak and may conquer us. No man escapes the action of this law simply by dying physically before the rebound. Somewhere he will live again, and in the next life he may find himself as much identified with evil as in the preceding life he thought himself to be identified with good. Undoubtedly, a strong carnal nature does have to be restrained, and in the case of those who do not have sufficient balanced will of wisdom, possibly extreme effort in restraint may be necessary for a time. But unquestionably, it is far better if this discipline is looked upon in the rational spirit of regarding it as simply a form of training. The problem is vastly simplified if the individual, instead of taking an attitude of fighting or suppressing, will undertake to transmute the carnal energy. Every form of energy, regardless of how seemingly evil it may be, has its higher mode or aspect into which it can be transformed. If the effort is focused upon this transforming, the energy is released and becomes a positive power, and this is relatively easy to do. But after all is said and done, asceticism related to the carnal nature belongs only to the kindergarten stage of training for the higher life of man. The higher and genuinely adult asceticisms are of an entirely different nature. Thus, when a man learns to become detached with respect to his pet opinions or ideas, and is willing to accept conclusions quite counter to his preferences when either evidence or logic points that way, then he is practicing asceticism in a higher and nobler sense. This kind of asceticism does cut far deeper into the real vitals of a man than any restraint connected with the mere carnal nature, and if he can succeed in the higher discipline, then anything remaining in the lesser nature requiring to be purified becomes a mere detail. In the superior discipline, the will has to become so highly developed that the carnal nature is controlled relatively easily, provided the effort is put forth. I would reduce the whole problem of asceticism to the following simple formula. Let the individual concentrate his effort upon that which he desires most and restrain or transform incompatible desires. What a man desires most may change as there is growth toward maturity. One implication of the formula then is to drop action in the direction of the old desire when the new and more potent desire takes place. Of course, discrimination must be made between a persistent new desire and a mere temporary uprising of an inferior desire. The rule is to be applied as indicated only in the former case. This course followed consistently will achieve for the individual ultimately his highest good, and sooner or later that will mean awakened consciousness. The advantage in this form of discipline lies largely in the fact that the center of emphasis is placed upon the position value to be achieved rather than upon the negative or interfering quality. It makes for a life of greater happiness, and this in turn arouses a great strength, all of which means the success will come more quickly, or at least as a rule. Of course, such a policy of life practice may very well involve one or more radical changes of direction in the life activity. Thus, a man may start his adult life with a desire to attain a great business success, but after having only partly completed his work, he may find a greater desire takes its place. In that case, he might have to forego great success in the business sense and remaining content with but moderate achievement in that field, throw the central focus of his energy in another direction. But while this would entail a smaller degree of success in the narrower field, the whole life of the individual, considered in the wider sense, would be more successful. Such a one would escape the tragedy of so many retired businessmen who, after leaving their businesses, find themselves quite helpless in a meaningless and barren life. From the standpoint of the awakened consciousness, all life below is of value only in the sense of training for higher life, and has nothing in it that is valuable as an end in itself. So, from the higher point of view, the judgment of what constitutes success in the subject object field is formed on quite a different basis from that of the usual world standard. Everything here below is instrumental and only instrumental. So, a life encompassing many but partial successes in the subject object field may actually be making more progress toward the awakening than a life which is highly successful in one concentrated field. From the higher standpoint, this lower life may be viewed in much the way a music master views his pupil. The music master has in mind finished perfection as the ultimate, but in the workshop of the studio, the time is given almost wholly to fragments, such as the technical handling of a phrase, the building of tone quality, etc. This life here is such a studio, and only that. The concert stage is cosmic consciousness. Once a man has awakened to the higher consciousness, he may make a decision that requires the very highest ascetic resolution. He knows the infinite superiority of the higher life in every sense, and if he had only himself individually to consider, naturally he would choose the higher life exclusively. But consideration for the needs of others may lead him to forego this and accept a life in the world, while at the same time it is not a life of the world. As a part of his work, he may move rather freely in the field of sensation, emotion, and etc., and may even seem self-indulgent to the superficial observer. Yet all the while he would be practicing asceticism in the severest sense, in the very living in that way. For him, there is not any longer a question of resisting carnal temptation, for knowledge of the higher joy has reduced all this to husks and ashes, relatively speaking. He simply endures what the carnal man imagines to be enjoyment. The whole problem of asceticism appears to me, from my present perspective, as merely one of rational judgment and wisdom, and is quite divorced from the emotional unpleasantness that is usually associated with it. It is simply good sense to choose the greater value in any conflict of values. Why should this be regarded as an occasion for serious emotional distress?